Hi, I'm Certified Cicerone Amy Beers, and it's time for Indy's Beer of the Month. My pick for April is actually a series of 3 similar but very different beers. This month, I'm featuring Upland Brewery's Tart series, starting with Petal to the Kettle, 2 of Tarts, and Modern Tart. Plus, there's a bonus beer at the end of this video. Obviously, I had a hard time picking just one beer to feature this month. We'll go behind the scenes to Upland's main production facility in Bloomington, Indiana, to talk with Lynch, the brewing director, to get an up-close look at their kettle souring process on this episode of Drinking with Beers. At one of Upland's locations in Fountain Square in Indianapolis, and today we're talking about their Tart series, starting with Petal to the Kettle. This beer was first brewed in 2016 as an experimental draft-only beer for their Side Trail series and ended up being a fan favorite. Now it's available in cans, and it sort of served as this precursor to their annual Tart series with a succession of 3 different kettle sours. The first to be released is Petal to the Kettle. Petal to the Kettle is a fun play on words that takes into account the rose petals that are used to make this beer, as well as the fact that it is a kettle sour. And then the bicycle speaks to Upland's outdoor and biking culture. Petal to the Kettle features notes of grapefruit, strawberry, and peach, which complement the aromas of rose and hibiscus, which is what gives the beer its pinkish purple hue. If you play your cards right, you can snag a can of this 2 of Tarts, which releases this month in April. 2 of Tarts falls under the category of being a goza with the addition of passion fruit and mango. So goza is a style of beer that originated during the Middle Ages in the town of Goslar, Germany, along the Goza River. It's estimated that in 1900 there were 80 goza houses. And then, unfortunately, after World War II, the style started to fade and just ceased to exist completely by 1966. But luckily, they started to revive the style in the 1980s, and slowly the goza made its way to the American craft beer scene. A traditional goza is brewed with Pilsner and wheat malts, and then it's seasoned with coriander and salt. It's kind of like a Berliner Weiss meets a Belgian wit. But the key defining feature of a goza is the salt, and a really good example will display a nice sea breeze characteristic. And it's a challenge to get right because you can easily oversalt or undersalt a goza. If done right, a goza should have a noticeable saltiness, but it shouldn't be so much that it's in your face. And I think that Upland does a really nice job at striking that balance. And the mild acidic flavors with that salt is a really nice combo, plus with the fruit additions, makes for a very nice, refreshing springtime ale. I still remember the first time I tried 2 of Tarts, and it's just stuck with me because it's just one of those beers that's just that good. And it's actually won an award at the Great American Beer Festival, and all these years later since I've tried it, I'm so excited to be featuring it as part of my April Beer of the Month series. Modern Tart is the last in the series and will be released later this fall. It is a kettle sour with apricot, and I love the way that Upland presents these apricot characteristics to your palate. It's been pretty well thought out. Because sour ales tend to undergo a very thorough fermentation process, kettle sours tend to finish really dry with little residual sweetness due to the fact of the yeast eating most of the sugars. Those greedy little... Imagine biting into a fruit that isn't sweet. It'd be kind of weird, right? So what Upland has done with Modern Tart is give back a little bit of that sweetness in the form of a sugar called lactose. I actually talked more about lactose in my last Beer of the Month feature for March when I featured Gugman's Milk Stout. So if you want to learn more about lactose, go check out that video. So Upland has added a dash of lactose to the Modern Tart, as well as Citra and Mosaic hops during a dry hopping process to give the beer some additional tropical fruit characteristics and provide a supporting background note to the apricot. So keep an eye out for Modern Tart coming this fall. Although these 3 kettle sours do have different flavor profiles, they all have one thing in common, and that is lactobacillus, which is what gives all of these ales in the Tart series that bright, refreshing, acidic flavor. In a minute, we'll go behind the scenes to Upland's main production facility in Bloomington. We'll talk with Lynch, who is their brewing director, to get a closer look at the kettle souring process. But first, here's a quick explanation on sour ales. While Upland does brew all styles of beer, they've really become renowned for their sour program. Upland brews traditional sours as well as kettle sours. So what's the difference? Sour ales utilize different types of yeast and bacteria to produce those sour, wild, funky notes. Brettanomyces is a type of yeast that produces what's often described as barnyard or earthy or that wild funk. These microorganisms occur just naturally in the air. They can be living in wooden barrels, but often in commercial brewing, they are added from a lab culture. Lactobacillus is a type of bacteria that produces those sour, acidic notes. And these organisms are often added in combination with Brettanomyces and then left to age in oak barrels for 6 months to sometimes years. Most barrel-aged sours age for about a year. Kettle sours, on the other hand, is sort of this quick and dirty method that takes place directly in a stainless steel kettle. These sours are produced only using Lactobacillus, which gives it that tart, acidic flavor. Unlike traditional sours, kettle sours don't need to age as long and can be produced in a relatively short amount of time. What you end up with is a beer that is sort of this just simple one-note sort of flavor versus those more complex, nuanced flavors that you might get from a long fermentation process with barrel aging. One isn't necessarily better than the other, it's just different. And I know there might be some really strong opinions out there regarding kettle sours, but hey, at the end of the day, isn't it all about what you enjoy? And if you enjoy it, what's left to debate? It's just beer, and isn't it all about enjoying what you like? So if you like it, great. I always say there's a time and a place for every beer. And now it's time to go to Upland's main production facility and chat with Patrick and learn more about the kettle souring process.
The kettle souring process starts off very similar to a standard brew of any other beer we brew here. We mill our grain the day before, we mash in, we do a mash rest, a Vorloff, a lauter. The lauter transfers the wort from the mash tun to the kettle. Once it's there, things start veering off in a direction that's very specific to the kettle sour process. Once we fill the kettle, we boil the wort very quickly. We don't add any hops or anything. We just bring it to a boil, which will make sure we kill off any yeast or bacteria that might naturally be in the grain, which will give us a nice neutral base for when we add the lactobacillus ourselves to make sure we have the only culture that will be souring the wort will be exactly what we add to it. So we bring it to a very quick boil, just a couple minutes in the kettle itself. We transfer it over to our whirlpool, and from there we can run it through our heat exchanger, which is usually what we use to send our finished wort into the fermenter. For a kettle sour, we go a little bit warmer and we send it back from our whirlpool through our heat exchanger back into our kettle at about 98 degrees, which is a nice temperature for pitching the lactobacillus in the kettle and letting it sit overnight, where the lactobacillus will help drop the pH of the wort, hence souring the wort in the kettle. From there, we will bring it to a boil again, and that'll be the day after. So tomorrow morning, the batch that we are starting today, we will bring it to another boil that will kill off the lactobacillus. And from there, it will proceed more as a standard beer once more, where we can pitch Saccharomyces beer yeast into the fermenter, 2-week fermentation, and it'll be nice and clean. That bacteria that we pitched in the kettle, that second boil will kill it off so that it's not cross-contaminating anything downstream for us. Yeah, the only bacteria that we add to our kettle sours here is lactobacillus, the same culture you would find in yogurt. So it kind of provides that familiar, pleasant, tart, slightly acidic character without being like barnyard funky. We don't add any Brettanomyces, Pediococcus, any of those other wild yeast strains or bacterias. It's just lactobacillus in our kettle sours. For the more complex flavors, you should check out the Upland sours coming out of the wood shop, but our kettle sour series is straight lactobacillus. At Upland, we do have 2 separate brewing facilities. We try to not cross-contaminate our wild yeast strains from our clean beer. So we do brew the Tart series at our production facility, but because we're able to boil the lactobacillus and avoid cross-contamination, it's safer to do it here and provide a nice, clean, controlled lactic fermentation here. Even though lactobacillus is the only culture we pitch, there are several different strains of lactobacillus available. We use lactobacillus from 2 separate yeast suppliers. One of them, the main driving force of our Tart series, is a single Lactobacillus plantarum strain. And we also blend in, another lactose source is a blend of plantarum and Lactobacillus brevis. Plantarum is the driving force for our Tart series. It provides a very pleasant tart character and little citrus notes that really blend well also with the fruits that we add to our Tart series. And it's just a very nice lactose strain to work with. It does well at the temperatures we want in the kettle, and it provides that pH drop fairly quickly so we can brew these over a 2-day span. So we add the lactobacillus to our kettle, and then not later on in the process, because we can keep it at a controlled temperature in our kettle, and then we can boil it once it's provided the pH drop that we need. Whereas if we add it later on in the process, it would be mixing in with our fermentation. It would be getting into our fermenters, our hoses, our soft parts throughout the process. So we can keep the lacto isolated to the kettle. It gives us all the flavor we want, all the acidity we want, all the pleasant tartness that we want. But then we can also freeze it there once we get everything out of it that we need. And then we boil it, and then we use our brewer's yeast and fermentation to consume the sugars and provide the alcohol that we need. But it's 2 separate processes that each give us exactly what we want and doesn't risk contaminating other parts of our process. We do have a beer currently in process. It's a small batch, but it's slightly different than our Tart series, where we teamed up with Dr. Matthew Bachman from IU. He's a yeast researcher here in Bloomington. And he's found some isolated yeast strains that actually simultaneously drop the pH to provide acidity and consume sugars to provide alcohol. So we do have a small batch of our beer called Breaking Away. That'll be out this April. And it's different from the Tart series, but that beer does provide a pH drop in fermentation simultaneously with the alcohol production. These acid-producing yeasts are a brand new thing and could be some of the future of not kettle sour beer, but tart beer production. There's a few yeast labs now just kind of getting into these yeast strains. We're very lucky here in Bloomington to team up with Dr. Bachman about finding some of the strains he's used. This will be our 3rd year doing a batch of Breaking Away. We've always kind of done it on the smaller scale versus our more widely available Tart series beers. Dr. Bachman is one of a few pioneers with these yeast strains. He was one of the first to find these strains, to brew some very small scale test batches and prove that they were a viable brewing strain. There are a few other labs in the country now producing similar yeast, but Bachman was definitely one of the first, and he was right here in our backyard in Bloomington. So Kettle Sours and Upland's Tart series, they follow a very standard fermentation track where the beer will be done in about 2 weeks from start to finish. Once we pitch that Saccharomyces, our house ale strain, to these beers, we mix some fruit in about halfway through fermentation. The 2 of Tarts batch that we're brewing today, we will add some passion fruit and mango a couple days into fermentation to get a nice fruit profile and give it some more sugars that will ferment out during fermentation. The challenges of scheduling our Tart series beers is that they take up space in our brew house for 2 days. At Upland, we can brew up to 4 batches or 150 barrels of beer in a day if we're brewing Dragonfly, Wheat, Champagne Velvet, some of our flagship core beers. If we're brewing a kettle sour beer, we can basically brew 2 batches of beer over 2 days. So it's a scheduling limitation where we can't brew as large volumes of beer and as frequently, but in terms of fermentation itself, it follows a pretty standard ale trajectory. Yeah, thanks for watching this video, everybody. I hope you come check out our Tart series, whether at an Upland location or if you find a 6-pack out of the store. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching. Cheers.